Have you ever found yourself feeling like your life is spiraling, no matter how hard you try to hold it together? Maybe you wake up every morning with a sense of dread or emptiness, not even sure how to explain it. It's like you're walking through life on autopilot. Your relationships are strained, your peace is slipping away, and something inside you feels off, disconnected from the life you know you should be living. You tell yourself that it's just the way things are, that this is just part of growing up, but deep down you know something is wrong. You feel it in your soul. Something is holding you back. But here's the terrifying part. What if the thing that's dragging you down is not some random twist of fate, not something you can just ignore and hope it goes away? What if there's something bigger, something that has been quietly eating away at your peace and your future? What if there are forces working against you? Forces you can't see but feel every day, keeping you from becoming the person God created you to be. A person full of joy, purpose, and peace. Padre Pio, a man who battled sin and temptation with all his strength, warned us about 3 deadly sins that have the power to ruin your life. And I'm not talking about small mistakes or bad habits. No, these sins are much darker. They are deadly, silent killers that can steal your peace, destroy your relationships, and even cloud your soul, pulling you farther from God and leading you into darkness. And the scariest part? You may already be living with these sins and not even realize it. Do you ever find yourself feeling trapped by desires you can't control? Thoughts that keep you awake at night, dragging you down into a place of shame? Perhaps you feel unworthy, like you're not enough, or that you're simply not living up to what God wants for you. You tell yourself that it's just a phase or I can't help it. But what if I told you these feelings, these struggles, aren't just random? They are a direct result of something much deeper. Sins that have slowly infiltrated your life and soul, poisoning everything they touch. But here's where the hope comes in. You don't have to stay trapped. You don't have to keep fighting a battle that feels impossible to win. Padre Pio not only warned us about these sins but also showed us how to fight them, how to break free. He faced his own demons, battled them day after day, and came out victorious. He didn't just talk about overcoming sin, he lived it. And if he could do it, so can you. It's time to stop living in guilt, fear, and frustration. It's time to break free from the chains that are holding you back. These deadly sins are robbing you of the peace and joy that God wants for you. But here's the good news. You can overcome them. In this video, I'm going to show you how to recognize these sins in your life and, more importantly, how to defeat them once and for all. I'm going to share the very same strategies that Padre Pio used to conquer temptation and restore his soul, and by the end of this video, you'll have the tools you need to start living a life full of grace, peace, and joy. You don't have to stay stuck. You don't have to keep suffering. You can reclaim the life God has planned for you, a life of freedom, hope, and fulfillment. So, if you're tired of feeling lost, if you're ready to break free from the chains of sin, this is your moment. Hit the subscribe button now. Don't let this opportunity slip away. What you hear in the next few minutes could change everything. And trust me, you won't want to miss it. Ethan had always appeared to have it all. From the outside, his life seemed picture-perfect. He had the car, the house, the job, and all the accolades that come with success. He was the kind of person people looked up to. Charming, intelligent, and always put together. His career was thriving, his social calendar was packed, and he had an endless supply of admirers. Yet, despite all this outward success, Ethan felt an empty space growing deeper inside him, a gnawing emptiness that nothing seemed to fill. At first, he convinced himself it was just a phase, a little burnout from the grind of his busy life. After all, who didn't feel overwhelmed by the pressures of work, family, and relationships? But the truth was much darker. There was a deeper issue beneath the surface that Ethan couldn't bring himself to face. He felt disconnected from himself, from those around him, and worst of all, from God. One evening, as he sat in his well-appointed office, a glass of whiskey in hand, his thoughts began to drift. He just closed another major business deal, secured another victory in the professional realm. Yet, all of it felt hollow. He stared at the glowing screen of his computer, but instead of feeling the satisfaction of success, all he felt was a nagging emptiness. He reached for his phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media as if the distraction could fill the void he was experiencing. That's when it began. the slow, insidious pull of temptation. Ethan's eyes lingered on a post, a photo of a woman he knew, someone he'd met at a party a few months ago. Their conversation had been brief, but something about the way she smiled at him had stuck in his mind. A thought crossed his mind. What if I reached out to her? Just to see what might happen? And just like that, his mind slipped into the dangerous territory of lust. At first, it was subtle. A harmless flirtation here and there. He told himself it wasn't a big deal. After all, he was only human, right? But soon, the fantasies began to take over. Every moment of downtime was filled with thoughts of this woman, of others like her, each new temptation feeding the craving he couldn't control. His mind was overwhelmed with images and desires, and his attention was consumed by the pursuit of fleeting pleasures. What started as a simple indulgence quickly grew into an obsession. And no matter how much he tried to distract himself with work, with friends, or with more material achievements, nothing seemed to satisfy that growing hunger inside him. As Ethan continued down this path, he began to notice something even more troubling. His sense of self was starting to change. The pride that had once been a driving force for his success now became a barrier to his growth. Ethan had always been confident. Too confident, perhaps, but the more he indulged in his desires, the more he became convinced that he was untouchable. He couldn't see his own flaws. All he could see were his strengths. He was successful, powerful, admired by those around him. So, why would he need to humble himself? Why should he admit any weakness? The very idea of admitting that something was wrong felt like a threat to everything he had built. He began to isolate himself from those who tried to reach out. Friends who once cared enough to question his behavior were now seen as enemies, trying to tear down his perfectly constructed image. He couldn't bear the thought of appearing weak, of acknowledging that he wasn't as perfect as he had convinced everyone, and himself, that he was. The pride that fueled his success now kept him in a prison of his own making. He was blind to his own faults, and worse yet, he didn't want to see them. But as the weeks passed, another problem began to creep in, one that Ethan had hoped he could ignore forever: his spiritual laziness. He'd grown up in a religious household, attended church every Sunday as a child, and knew the importance of faith. Yet, as he grew older and more consumed with his career and personal pursuits, God seemed to fade into the background. Church became something he used to do, not something that mattered anymore. Prayer felt like a chore, a ritual that didn't bring him peace or comfort. In fact, he had stopped praying altogether. Ethan told himself that he was too busy for church. Work had to come first, social obligations were more important, and honestly, he didn't even see the point. He was a good person, wasn't he? Surely, that was enough. But deep inside, a small voice was whispering, a quiet, persistent reminder of the life he had once lived. He couldn't ignore it forever, but he tried. And with every passing day, that distance from God grew wider. He told himself he didn't need to pray. He didn't need to go to Massachusetts. In the back of his mind, he rationalized, "I'm fine. My life is fine." But it wasn't fine. It was falling apart. His relationships began to deteriorate. His friends noticed the change. They tried to reach out, but Ethan pushed them away. He was too proud to admit that he needed help, and too ashamed to face the reality of his actions. His relationship with his family became strained as well. The distance between him and the people he cared about grew. He no longer found joy in the things he used to love. His career, while still successful, began to feel like a never-ending chase for more, a pursuit that was no longer fulfilling. It wasn't until one fateful night, when he found himself alone in his office, staring blankly at the empty walls around him, that Ethan realized just how far he had fallen. He was caught in a web of his own making. His indulgences, his pride, his neglect of his spiritual life, they had all led him to this moment of profound emptiness. He had built a life that appeared perfect, but inside, he was dying. He was drowning in the very sins that he had once brushed aside as just a part of life. Lust, pride, and spiritual laziness, each one had crept in, quietly but surely, until they controlled every aspect of his life. And now, as he sat in the stillness of his office, Ethan finally saw the truth. He couldn't fix this on his own. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something that he hadn't felt in years: desperation. The walls he had built around himself were crumbling, and he didn't know how to stop it. He had spent so long chasing after success and pleasure, never realizing that the thing he needed most, true peace, true purpose, was something only God could give him. And so, he began the painful, humbling process of confronting his sins. Ethan didn't know how to do it. He didn't know where to start, but he knew one thing. If he didn't do something now, if he didn't turn his life around, it would all slip away. His career, his relationships, his soul, they would all be lost forever. The journey was long, but it was the only path left for Ethan. It was time to face his flaws, to accept his mistakes, and to humble himself before the very God he had pushed aside for so long. Have you ever felt like Ethan? Struggling with desires you can't control? Too proud to admit your flaws or ask for help? Or perhaps you've neglected your spiritual life for so long that you can't even remember what it felt like to pray with purpose. If any of this resonates with you, then you're not alone. In the next part of Ethan's story, we'll uncover how he began the difficult but life-changing process of breaking free from these sins. Stay with me. This is where the real transformation begins. But before we continue, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where you realized that something in your life needed to change? What was that moment like for you? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what comes next. Ethan's journey is about to take a powerful turn. Stay with me, because the best is yet to come. Ethan's life was spiraling out of control. He had once been a man of ambition, a man who chased success with a relentless fervor. His days were filled with meetings, deadlines, and a constant pursuit of more. More recognition, more achievements, more satisfaction. He'd always believed that if he could just get ahead, if he could just climb one more rung on the ladder of success, then everything would be perfect. But perfection, as he had come to learn, was a mirage. The harder he tried to grasp it, the more it slipped through his fingers. His struggle had reached a breaking point. Despite his outward success, Ethan could no longer ignore the emptiness he felt inside. Every day seemed to blur into the next, and the pressure he placed on himself only added weight to the crushing feeling of dissatisfaction. His mind, constantly occupied by lustful thoughts and fantasies, would wander during important meetings or conversations. The pride that had once fueled him now made it impossible to ask for help, to admit that he was losing control. And worst of all, the spiritual laziness that had crept into his life made everything feel distant. His faith, his purpose, and his connection with God. One night, after yet another exhausting day of pretending everything was fine, Ethan found himself sitting alone in his apartment, staring at the television. He flipped through channels aimlessly, trying to distract himself from the overwhelming thoughts in his head. But nothing seemed to ease the discomfort. He felt as if his mind was on fire. His soul caught between the desires that ruled him and the faint whispers of something deeper, something truer. That night, it was as if the world had conspired to bring him face to face with the truth he had been running from. The TV landed on a late-night sermon. Ethan didn't even know what channel it was. He wasn't particularly religious, but the words he heard pierced through his defenses. It was a message about the deadly sins, about the very things that had been eating away at him for months. The speaker was discussing pride, lust, and spiritual laziness, and it felt as though every word was meant just for him. Ethan could almost imagine the voice of Padre Pio himself, a man known for his deep spiritual battles against sin, calling out to him from the screen. Ethan's heart began to race as the sermon unfolded. He couldn't look away. It was as if something deep inside him had been awakened. The preacher spoke of the consequences of indulgence, how pride blinds us to our faults, how lust poisons our relationships, and how neglecting our spiritual health leads to a soul's decay. The words hung in the air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan began to understand the magnitude of his actions. He realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that he had been living in a self-constructed prison. His success, his wealth, his social standing, none of it had brought him the peace he had been desperately seeking. Instead, it had only driven him further from the person he used to be, from the person he was meant to be. He had let his desires take control, and now he was a slave to them. He had let pride keep him from admitting his faults, from reaching out for help. And worst of all, he had neglected the very source of his strength, his faith. In that moment, Ethan's life came crashing into focus. The voice of the preacher seemed to echo the internal cries of his heart, and for the first time in a long time, he began to feel a deep, aching sorrow for his sins. But that sorrow quickly morphed into a wave of despair. How could he ever change? How could he break free from the web of sin he had so willingly woven around himself? The guilt weighed heavily on him, a burden he had been too proud to acknowledge until now. He had ignored the warning signs, had shoved the whispers of his conscience into the background, convinced himself that he could handle it on his own. But he couldn't. Not anymore. As the sermon came to an end, Ethan sat in silence. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in on him. He could no longer ignore the truth. His life was falling apart, and he had no idea how to put the pieces back together. For a moment, Ethan considered what the preacher had said about Padre Pio, how this humble priest, despite all his personal struggles, had remained steadfast in his fight against sin. The story of Padre Pio, a man who had spent years in constant prayer, battling the temptations that sought to destroy him, resonated deeply with Ethan. How had Padre Pio remained so strong in the face of such overwhelming challenges? What had he done to overcome the same sins that had ensnared Ethan? It was a question that lingered in Ethan's mind as he sat there, alone with his thoughts. He realized that the answer, the solution to his struggles, wasn't going to come from more success, more distractions, or more indulgences. It wasn't going to come from his own strength, his own willpower. It was going to come from surrender, surrendering his pride, his lust, and his spiritual laziness to God. But how? How could he begin to break free from these powerful forces that had so thoroughly taken hold of his life? The path to change, he knew, was not going to be easy. It would require humility, discipline, and a deep reliance on God's grace. It would mean confronting the parts of himself he had long ignored, the parts of him that had been blinded by pride, the parts that had given in to temptation, and the parts that had neglected the life of prayer and faith that had once sustained him. It would require more than just a fleeting moment of regret. It would require a complete transformation of his heart and mind. But despite the overwhelming feeling of despair, there was a glimmer of hope. In that moment of confrontation with the truth, Ethan realized that he didn't have to face this battle alone. He wasn't the first person to struggle with these sins, and he wouldn't be the last. The message of redemption, of grace, was available to him too. And though he didn't know exactly how to begin, he knew that something had to change. He had to take the first step, no matter how small, toward healing and restoration. That night, Ethan made a decision. He didn't know exactly what it would look like, but he knew that he had to make a change. The journey ahead would be long, but it was the only path that could lead him back to the life he had been seeking all along, a life of peace, of purpose, and of a renewed relationship with God. As Ethan lay in bed that night, his mind was still racing. He thought of Padre Pio, of his relentless struggle against sin, and of the hope that had been made available to all who sought it. He knew that the road to redemption wasn't easy, but he also knew that it was worth it. If Padre Pio could do it, if countless others throughout history had overcome their struggles with faith and perseverance, then so could he. The next morning, Ethan made a vow to himself. He would no longer live in denial. He would no longer ignore the truth of his situation. He would confront his sins head-on, one at a time, and he would seek the help and strength he so desperately needed from God. And so, Ethan's journey of transformation began, not with a grand gesture, but with a simple, honest decision to face his flaws and seek the healing he needed. It was a decision that would set him on a path of true freedom, a path that would lead him away from the sins that had controlled his life and toward the grace and redemption he had been longing for. Ethan was exhausted. He had been struggling for what felt like an eternity, caught in the relentless cycle of sin and regret. Each day, he told himself he would change. He promised himself that today would be different. But each day, the same pattern repeated. The same temptations, the same failures, the same feelings of guilt and shame. No matter how hard he tried to overcome his vices on his own, he found himself falling deeper into despair. The grip of his sins, lust, pride, and spiritual laziness, seemed stronger than ever. He had tried everything. He tried to stay busy, burying himself in work. He tried to avoid situations that triggered his temptations. He even tried praying, but his prayers felt hollow, like words lost in an empty room. No matter what he did, nothing seemed to help. Each failure felt like a weight around his neck, pulling him down further. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, and the walls seemed to be closing in faster with each passing day. The more he tried to fight, the weaker he became. The more he tried to control his desires, the stronger they seemed to grow. And the more he failed, the more he became convinced that he was unworthy of God's love and forgiveness. He would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, feeling utterly alone. The feelings of guilt would wash over him in waves, drowning him in despair. The enemy whispered in his ear, telling him he was beyond redemption, telling him that he had failed too many times to ever be forgiven. The voice was relentless, always present, always telling him he wasn't good enough, he wasn't worthy of grace. But somewhere deep inside, there was a flicker of hope. It was faint, but it was there. It was the memory of something he had once heard, something that had never truly left him. God never abandons those who sincerely fight against sin. It was a simple phrase, but it had stuck with him. It had been said by someone he didn't know, someone he had never met, but it felt like a message meant just for him. Those words, those simple yet powerful words, came back to him now, like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in an ocean of guilt. They reminded him that God hadn't abandoned him, even though it felt like he had fallen too far to be helped. Ethan remembered reading about Padre Pio, a man who had fought a relentless battle against sin. Padre Pio was known for his deep spirituality and his unwavering devotion to God, but he had also struggled with the very same temptations that Ethan was facing. Padre Pio had spent years battling his own weaknesses, yet he had never given up. And through all of his struggles, he had always held on to the belief that God was with him, even in his darkest moments. For Ethan, this was a revelation. If Padre Pio, a man who had experienced such intense spiritual struggles, could find hope and strength in God's grace, then surely he could, too. Ethan didn't have to keep fighting alone. He didn't have to carry the weight of his sins on his own shoulders. There was a way out, a path forward, and it was through the grace and mercy of God. With a sense of urgency, Ethan made a decision. He would no longer try to fight this battle on his own. He would turn to the one place where he could find true healing: confession. At first, the idea of confession terrified him. The thought of admitting his sins to another person, of exposing the darkest parts of himself, made him feel vulnerable and ashamed. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it was the only way forward. He couldn't continue to live in isolation, keeping his sins hidden in the darkness. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when he was slowly dying inside. Ethan had heard many times that confession wasn't just about admitting your wrongs. It was about experiencing God's forgiveness and grace. It was a sacrament of healing, a chance to be set free from the chains that bound him. But still, the fear lingered. What if he wasn't truly forgiven? What if his sins were too great to be forgiven? But that small flicker of hope, the memory of Padre Pio's words, pushed him forward. He couldn't let fear control him any longer. He had to take the first step. The day he went to confession, Ethan felt like he was walking into the unknown. The priest greeted him warmly, but Ethan could see the kindness in his eyes, a kindness that reminded him of God's love. He sat down, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. As he began to confess his sins, the weight on his heart began to lift. It was as if the walls that had been closing in on him were suddenly opening up. The priest listened patiently, offering words of compassion and understanding. But it wasn't just the priest's words that brought Ethan comfort, it was the sense of peace that washed over him as he spoke. When he finished confessing, the priest gave him absolution, and in that moment, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. It wasn't a peace that came from external circumstances. It wasn't a peace that could be found in success or pleasure or any of the things he had once chased. It was a peace that came from deep within, a peace that could only come from God. In that moment, Ethan realized something profound. He was loved. Despite everything he had done, despite all of his failures, God still loved him. And more than that, God was offering him the grace to start over. The shame that had once consumed him was replaced with a sense of freedom, a freedom that he had been longing for without even realizing it. But even as he left the confessional, Ethan knew that the battle wasn't over. The temptations would still come. The pride, the lust, the laziness, they would all still be there, lurking in the shadows. But now, Ethan had something he had never had before: the power of God's grace. It wasn't going to be easy. The road to healing would be long, and there would be times when Ethan would fall again. But he now understood something that had eluded him for so long. He didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to do it all on his own. What mattered was that he kept getting back up, that he kept seeking God's forgiveness, and that he kept fighting the good fight. As he walked out of the church that day, Ethan felt lighter. He knew that he had taken the first step toward healing, but he also knew that this was just the beginning. There would be struggles ahead, but now he was armed with the most powerful weapon of all: God's grace. And so, Ethan's journey continued. The road to healing wasn't easy, but with each step, he grew stronger. He knew that the battle against sin would never be over, but he also knew that he was not alone. God was with him, and with God's help, he could overcome anything. Ethan's heart was still racing from the powerful experience of confession. As he sat in the pew, the weight of his sins lifted, but the road ahead was unclear. He knew that a single confession, no matter how profound, was not a magic solution. It was only the beginning. The priest's words had been comforting, but now, it was up to Ethan to put those words into action. He had heard countless stories of people who had experienced dramatic transformations after confessing their sins, but Ethan knew that the true challenge was in the journey of staying committed to the changes. He could no longer afford to take his faith lightly or rely on his own strength to overcome his vices. This was going to take effort, dedication, and most importantly, the grace of God. As he walked out of the church, Ethan was reminded of something his confessor had told him: the road to healing is not a sprint. It is a marathon. Those words resonated deeply with him. There was no quick fix. No magical moment where everything would suddenly be perfect. No, this was going to require work. Real, hard work. The next day, Ethan returned to the church to pray. He knelt before the altar, closing his eyes in prayer, asking God to guide him on this difficult journey. His heart felt lighter, but his mind was still heavy with questions. How could he change? How could he break free from the grip of lust, pride, and spiritual laziness that had entangled him for so long? It was then that he recalled the conversation he had had with the priest during confession. The priest had offered him a specific strategy for overcoming his weaknesses, a strategy rooted in the wisdom of the saints, particularly the example of Padre Pio. Ethan had heard of Padre Pio before, a man who had fought with everything he had to overcome his own battles with sin, and who had emerged victorious, not through his own strength, but through God's grace. If Padre Pio could overcome such intense spiritual struggles, then surely Ethan could find the strength to overcome his own. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. He knew he wasn't alone in this fight. The path to redemption was difficult, yes, but it was not impossible. The priest had given him 3 specific pieces of advice. For his struggle with lust, the priest had recommended discipline. Lust was a powerful temptation, one that could easily entrap someone who wasn't vigilant. The priest advised Ethan to practice fasting, an ancient practice that could help him regain control over his desires. But fasting, the priest explained, wasn't just about abstaining from food. It was about disciplining the body so that the soul could grow stronger. Along with fasting, the priest encouraged him to pair this with prayer. The more Ethan prayed, the more he would be able to see through the lies of the enemy and resist the pull of temptation. For his struggle with pride, the priest challenged Ethan to serve others. Pride had a way of convincing us that we were better than others, that we were entitled to special treatment or recognition. But the priest knew that the key to humility was service. He encouraged Ethan to reach out to the poor and the needy, to give of his time and resources without expecting anything in return. It was in serving others that Ethan would learn to let go of his inflated sense of self-importance and embrace the humility that comes from recognizing the value of others. Finally, for his struggle with spiritual laziness, the priest advised Ethan to establish a daily routine of prayer. Spiritual laziness often stemmed from a lack of discipline, a tendency to put off what was most important in favor of what was most immediately satisfying. The priest told Ethan to start small, to build his prayer life gradually. He recommended that Ethan begin by praying the rosary each day. It was a powerful devotion that could help him grow closer to Jesus through the intercession of Mary. The more Ethan committed to prayer, the more his relationship with God would deepen, and the less room there would be for laziness to creep in. Ethan left the church that day with a sense of purpose. The strategy was clear. Now it was up to him to follow through. The first few days were difficult. Old habits die hard, and Ethan found himself struggling to maintain his resolve. The pull of lust was strong, and he often found himself distracted by his own desires. But as he committed to fasting, even if it was just for a few hours a day, he noticed something remarkable. The more he practiced self-discipline, the less power those desires had over him. It wasn't easy. There were moments when he wanted to give in, when the temptation felt too strong to resist. But he kept praying, asking God for the strength to fight. And each time he overcame a temptation, he felt a sense of victory, a reminder that with God's help, anything was possible. Next, he turned to the advice about pride. Ethan knew that he had been arrogant in many ways, believing he was superior to others and failing to recognize the value of those around him. The priest's challenge to serve others felt daunting at first. Ethan was used to focusing on his own needs and desires, but now he had to shift his focus. He began volunteering at a local shelter, helping to serve meals and spend time with the people there. At first, it felt uncomfortable, even humiliating. But as he continued to serve, he began to see something beautiful. He saw the faces of people who had nothing, and yet they were joyful. They were filled with gratitude, something that made Ethan realize how much he had taken for granted in his own life. Each small act of service humbled him and reminded him that he wasn't as important as he had once thought. There was a beauty in humility that he had never appreciated before, and it began to transform him from the inside out. The final piece of advice, to pray daily, was perhaps the most challenging for Ethan. He had always struggled with consistency when it came to prayer. But the priest had told him that the rosary was a powerful weapon in the spiritual life, and so Ethan committed to praying it every day. At first, his mind would wander, and he would find himself frustrated. But with time, he began to feel a sense of peace that he had never experienced before. It was as if each Hail Mary, each Our Father, brought him closer to God, and the distractions of the world faded into the background. Prayer became his refuge, his daily connection to the divine. Ethan's life began to change in small but profound ways. The lust that had once consumed him no longer held the same power. He found himself more at peace, more in control of his desires. His pride began to crumble as he recognized the value of others and embraced humility. And his spiritual laziness was replaced with a deep hunger for prayer and connection with God. Each day felt like a victory, and he could see the transformation taking place in his heart. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a turning point in your life where you made a commitment to change and started taking steps toward healing? What challenges have you faced in your own journey, and how did you overcome them? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories and guidance on your own spiritual journey. As we navigate through life, it is inevitable that we will face moments of struggle, pain, and even temptation. For some, these battles are not just isolated incidents but ongoing, relentless challenges that seem to take root in our hearts and minds. But there is hope, and it lies in the power of God's grace, the same grace that transformed the life of Ethan, a man who once stood on the brink of despair. Ethan's story is one of redemption, perseverance, and, ultimately, triumph. It is a reminder that no matter how far we may fall or how deeply ensnared by sin we may feel, there is always a path forward, one that leads to healing, restoration, and a renewed relationship with God. This journey of transformation isn't quick or easy, but it is possible. It is a journey that requires faith, dedication, and a willingness to surrender to God's will. When Ethan first embarked on his journey of spiritual renewal, he was a man broken by the weight of his sins. He struggled with the deadly sins of lust, pride, and spiritual laziness, sins that had entrenched themselves deeply in his life. Despite his attempts to break free, he often found himself falling short, convinced that he was unworthy of God's forgiveness. He struggled with shame and guilt, constantly battling with the voice that told him he was beyond redemption. But the truth is, no one is beyond God's love. Not even Ethan. In the beginning, Ethan could not have imagined the incredible transformation that awaited him. Each day felt like an uphill battle, one in which he often stumbled, tripped, and fell. But there was a fire that had been ignited within him, a desire to overcome the darkness that had clouded his life for so long. This spark, though small, was enough to drive him forward. And it was in this struggle, this ongoing battle against his temptations, that Ethan found the strength to continue. Over time, as he followed the practical advice he had received, fasting, serving others, praying consistently, he began to see changes. The grip of lust, once so powerful and consuming, began to loosen. He no longer found himself dominated by impure thoughts or desires. The discipline he had cultivated through fasting and prayer became a shield that protected him from temptation. He was no longer enslaved by his passions. Instead, he had gained control over them. But this wasn't just a change in behavior. It was a change in his heart. The process of purging lust from his life was not just about avoiding temptation, but about cultivating a deeper love for God. As his heart became more aligned with God's will, his desires began to shift. No longer was he seeking fleeting pleasures. Instead, he found joy in purity and in the knowledge that his actions were honoring God. Likewise, his struggle with pride slowly began to dissolve. The pride that had once made him feel superior to others, the arrogance that had clouded his interactions, was replaced with humility. Serving others, especially those in need, helped Ethan recognize the worth and dignity of every human being. Each time he reached out to help someone, he was reminded that greatness is not found in wealth, status, or power, but in selfless love and service. This transformation was not just a shift in attitude, but a complete reordering of his priorities. Perhaps the most profound change, however, came in his battle with spiritual laziness. Ethan's once apathetic approach to his faith was replaced by an insatiable thirst for God. The spiritual practices that had once felt like burdens now became lifelines. He began to crave prayer, finding strength and peace in his daily conversations with God. His relationship with God deepened in ways he never thought possible. The more he prayed, the more he yearned for the presence of God. The distractions of the world no longer held the same allure. Instead, Ethan found himself consumed by the desire to grow closer to his Creator. As Ethan's transformation continued, it became evident to those around him. Friends, family, and even strangers began to notice the change in him. Where once there had been a man consumed by self-doubt, pride, and impurity, there was now someone who radiated peace, humility, and love. His heart had been transformed, and this transformation was visible to all who encountered him. He was no longer defined by his past mistakes, but by the grace of God that had healed and redeemed him. But the most remarkable aspect of Ethan's journey wasn't just his personal transformation. It was the way in which he became a beacon of hope for others. Ethan knew that his struggle was not unique. Many people struggled with the same vices, the same temptations, and the same feelings of inadequacy. He wanted to share his story with others, to let them know that no matter how far they had fallen, there was always a way back. He began to speak openly about his journey, sharing his experiences with anyone who would listen. Whether through casual conversations or formal presentations, Ethan's story became a source of inspiration for others who were struggling with their own battles against sin. He encouraged people to never give up, to keep fighting, and to trust in God's grace. His message was simple but powerful: redemption is possible, and with God's help, anyone can overcome their struggles. As he spoke to others, Ethan found that his own faith grew even stronger. Each time he shared his story, he was reminded of the incredible power of God's love and mercy. He had been saved from the grip of sin, not through his own strength, but through the grace of God. And this grace was available to anyone who was willing to accept it. In reflecting on his journey, Ethan came to understand something profound. True victory is not about perfection, it's about persistence. It's about continuing to fight, even when it feels like you're losing. It's about trusting in God's strength when your own is insufficient. The key to Ethan's victory was not in his ability to overcome every temptation or to never fall again, but in his willingness to keep going, to keep seeking God, and to keep allowing God to work in his life. This is the essence of the message that Padre Pio so often shared. God's grace is more powerful than any temptation, and no sin is too great to be forgiven. But this grace requires perseverance, a willingness to continue despite the struggles, and a heart that is open to transformation. As Padre Pio himself experienced, the road to holiness is not an easy one, but it is a road worth walking. If you are struggling with any of the sins that Ethan once faced, whether it be lust, pride, or spiritual laziness, remember that you are not alone. God's grace is available to you, and through persistence, prayer, and humility, you can experience the same transformation that Ethan did. Your past does not define you, God's love does. And just like Ethan, you too can find a renewed sense of purpose and peace through God's grace. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment of transformation in your own life? How did you overcome your struggles? And what role did faith play in your journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories and spiritual guidance. Your story may just be the encouragement someone else needs to keep going, so don't hesitate to share. And remember, God's grace is always available, no matter where you are on your journey. As we reach the end of this powerful journey together, I want to take a moment to reflect on everything we've covered in today's video. From Ethan's struggle with deadly sins to his incredible journey of transformation, we've seen just how powerful God's grace can be when we open ourselves to it and allow it to work in our lives. I hope you're walking away from this video with a renewed sense of hope and understanding about the importance of perseverance, faith, and surrendering to God's will. Ethan's story is more than just a personal transformation. It is a reminder that each one of us has the power to break free from the chains of sin and live a life of purity, humility, and devotion. No matter how lost you may feel, how deep into temptation or despair you think you've fallen, there is always hope. God's grace is stronger than any temptation, any vice, or any obstacle. But it's not always an easy road. It takes effort, it takes time, and it takes a willingness to fight. Just as we saw with Ethan, overcoming our struggles isn't about being perfect, it's about being persistent. Let's quickly recap the key points that made Ethan's journey so remarkable. First, we saw how he was ensnared by the deadly sins of lust, pride, and spiritual laziness. These were not just small struggles. They consumed his thoughts, actions, and relationships. Ethan felt trapped, hopeless, and at the mercy of his own weaknesses. But then came the pivotal moment, the encounter with the truth in the form of a powerful sermon on the mortal sins that were ruining his life. This was the wake-up call Ethan so desperately needed, but it wasn't an instant fix. It wasn't a magical moment where everything changed. No, this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey toward transformation. From that point on, Ethan began to make changes. He confessed his sins, accepted the advice of a wise and caring priest, and began to take small, intentional steps toward overcoming his temptations. Fasting, prayer, and service to others became his tools for transformation. These were not easy tasks. In fact, they were incredibly difficult, and there were many moments where Ethan felt like giving up. But he didn't. He kept going. He kept fighting. And eventually, God's grace became so strong in his life that he was able to overcome his vices and sins. He was freed from the grip of lust, pride, and laziness, and he discovered a deep, unshakable love for God that filled him with peace and purpose. What's most remarkable about Ethan's transformation is not just that he overcame his struggles, but that he went on to inspire others. He became a beacon of hope for those who were trapped in the same temptations and battles. By sharing his story and encouraging others to keep fighting, Ethan became a living testament to the truth of God's love and forgiveness. And that's the ultimate goal for all of us, to not only experience transformation in our own lives but to share that transformation with others, so they too can find hope and healing in God. Now, this transformation is not something that happens overnight, and it's certainly not easy. But as Ethan's story shows us, it is possible. It is possible to overcome lust, pride, and spiritual laziness, and it is possible to live a life that is completely dedicated to God. The question is, are you willing to put in the effort? Are you willing to surrender your weaknesses to God and allow His grace to work in you? If you're ready to start your own journey of transformation, I invite you to take the next step. For those of you who are feeling inspired and motivated by Ethan's story, I encourage you to dive deeper into this topic by checking out our special playlist. Inside, you'll find more stories, teachings, and insights about how to break free from sin, live a life of purity, and grow closer to God. This playlist is packed with content that will help guide you through the struggles you're facing and give you practical tools to transform your life, just like Ethan did. Don't let this opportunity slip by. Click on the playlist and start watching. You'll find that the next step in your journey of transformation is right at your fingertips. As you watch these videos, you'll discover that overcoming temptation, building a stronger relationship with God, and living a life of purpose isn't just a distant dream. It's a reality that's waiting for you. And if you're committed to making that change, if you're determined to fight for your spiritual freedom, these videos will be an invaluable resource to you. But remember, transformation doesn't happen alone. That's why I want to hear from you. What did you think of Ethan's story? Have you ever struggled with some of the same issues he faced? How did you find the strength to overcome them? Or maybe you're just starting your journey and have questions. Whatever it may be, I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments section below. I'd love to hear your feedback and connect with you on a deeper level. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. When you subscribe, you're joining a community of like-minded individuals who are all striving to grow in faith, fight against sin, and live more purposeful, Christ-centered lives. By subscribing, you're not just keeping up with the videos. You're making a commitment to yourself to continue growing in your faith and learning how to overcome the struggles you face. So, leave your comment, subscribe, and make sure to check out the playlist. This is your chance to take the next step in your spiritual journey, to unlock the transformation that's waiting for you. Don't let fear or doubt hold you back. Remember, like Ethan, you too can experience a life that's renewed in God's grace. Keep fighting, keep believing, and never give up. God is with you every step of the way. Thank you for being part of today's video, and I can't wait to continue this journey with you. Let's grow in faith together. See you in the next video.